Hello, welcome to Board Game TV, and I want to announce another Halloween surprise I'm doing this month. We're going to take an in-depth review of the Ravenloft campaign setting for Dungeons and Dragons. As you can see, I have just about everything Ravenloft. Now, first I want to explain a little bit about why a Board Game channel is talking about Dungeons and Dragons, which is a role-playing game. And I really want to think about how board games these days, modern board games, and really about all board games, really since Dungeons and Dragons came out, a lot of them are trying to emulate or be like Dungeons and Dragons. They're just trying to be a board game version of it. Shadows of Brimstone has its roots in Dungeons and Dragons. Descent has its roots in Dungeons and Dragons. Gloomhaven, Pathfinder, all these games that we play in board games, where we have a board and we level up characters and try to find items and stuff, all can pay homage, originate from Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, let's face it. I mean, even Dungeons and Dragons puts out board games now, and I think the two genres are very closely related. I don't think we would have board games like we have now if Dungeons and Dragons had never existed. And most people who play board games in depth, like people in my audience, I would think have at least one time or another played a role-playing game like Dungeons and Dragons. Especially the older ones, like myself, who grew up in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And the board games weren't like they were now, and Dungeons and Dragons was really kind of an in popularity thing. Dungeons and Dragons really had two eras of greatness, in my opinion. The late 70s to early 80s, and then starting back up in the 90s when they really hit their prime, going to the mid 90s before they kind of went bankrupt. The theme is basically fantasy gaming. That, you know, and Dungeons and Dragons expanded a little bit, but we'll get into that in a minute. But when I was a young kid, I think around 1980, my mother bought me the Dungeons and Dragons basic set as a gift. And back then you could buy Dungeons and Dragons stuffs at a bookstore, but you can also buy them at toy stores. KB Toys sold them in Toys R Us and stuff like that. And I became hooked. I very much loved it. I played by myself when I could. I started playing with other people. Sometimes most of the time in the early days, I would be a dungeon master because nobody else bought the stuff. I would save my allowance, and every time I would go to a store, I would buy a module or get a source book. And when Dungeons and Dragons, when I played, this was the basic format for the modules, as you can see. It was this style of modules, like this, that I really got into. And I had many of these modules. And then I ended up meeting people, and we started playing more and more, and I was always a dungeon master. I started being an adventurer. We would play through my modules. I would be the dungeon master, and through my friends' modules, whenever we played them, they would be the dungeon master. But in about 1983, TSR changed the format of their modules from looking like that to looking like this. And you can tell a big difference. Just the way the structure. I love this format. This is what I grew up on, and I loved it. When they changed it to this style looking format, I stopped buying Dungeons and Dragons. I wasn't happy with it. I don't know why. It just didn't seem the same. It just seemed when they changed the style, and you just had the little back thing, and you know these had pictures on the back and all that. It just seemed to lose something for me. I love that golden era of Dungeons and Dragons. However, back in 1983, when this came out, I saw it at a store, and it looked really cool. There was a vampire on the cover, and I read the back, and I said, you know what? I'm going to make an exception, and I'm going to get that. Because ever since I was a kid, I loved horror. I mean, and my favorite part of Dungeons & Dragons when I played, I always loved the undead monsters. The ghosts, the vampires, the lynches, the specters, skeletons. I always loved them more than any other monsters, more than dragons, more than the giants, and all that kind of stuff. So this was I saw it, I got it, and I was very happy with it. It was intended to be a Halloween module because, you know, there had nothing like that before in those days. You had plenty of fantasy modules. Hell, you even had some sci-fi with TSR, with, you know, stuff like Expedition to Bury Your Peaks, Gamma World and Spelljammer and all that stuff. I know Gamma World was out. I'm not sure Spelljammer was. I think it may have been. And then of course you had Buck Rogers stuff, but you really didn't have any good horror. Not that you could readily. You had to have a hobby shop in order to find horror. I think maybe the Arkham stuff was out there, but I mean it was real hard to find for a person like me. And you know, of course, back then you didn't have the internet or nothing like that. And so this became something I played, and it is a modern day. It's a classic. It's one of the, when you talk about Dungeons and Dragons classic modules, you know, Tomb of Horrors, Against the Giants, Expedition to Bury Your Peaks, Ravenloft is mentioned with those, because it is a great module. It introduces Kaltstrad von Zarovich. He's a vampire. He's he has a domain. It's called Barovia. It's, you know, a new place. And basically, the heroes, your party of heroes, get trapped in Barovia because there's a ring of fog that surrounds. Once you get in, you can't leave. The only way you can leave Barovia is kill him or defeat him. So there's a town, you know, the town of Barovia, and you go in there, and he's attacking the town, basically trying to find the lady Titania or whatever her name is, or Tatiana. He's in love with her. He wants to make her his vampire bride, his wife. And so you have to, the burgomaster, which is like the mayor of the village, pleads with you, go see the gypsies, see if you can go to Castle Ravenloft, which is the castle where he lives, and destroy him and save my daughter. And that is the basis of the adventure. And you know, you see it comes with these cool maps. You have the lands of Barovia, the village, where it comes. There's the village right there. This module had a lot to offer. And he played differently than most villains in modules. You know, most modules, let's be honest, you go through the module, you end up eventually fighting the big baddie, and you either beat him or you don't. Okay. So he played differently though. He did these guerrilla hit and run tactics on you when you played the module. He would pop up, shoot some magic spell at you, or try to hypnotize you, and then disappear, and then later on try to do it. So it was really fun to play. Also, what they introduced on this was the fortunes. You would take a deck of cards, any deck, and you would do a fortune telling, and it would tell you what your goals of the game was and where they would be located. Like you could find the icon of Ravenloft or the Sun Sword or where you would find Stride himself. It was really a unique adventure. It was groundbreaking. It was a big hit, and I loved it, and it kept me in D&D for a little while longer, I'll be honest with you. Even though I didn't buy any more of these style modules, I still would every Halloween would play this with a buddy of mine. This came out in 1983. Okay, so let's fast forward to 1986, and a sequel is made because, hell, when you do something great, you want to make a sequel. And it was made by the people who made the first one, Tracy and Laura Hickman. And you know, Laura is famous for Dragonlance. That's what they're really famous for, is, you know, the Dragonlance stuff. And it's a sequel to Ravenloft. Now, it came with a big map. It is a lot more complex, and it introduces a lot more stuff. It takes place in a different land, okay, and it's basically the house on Griffin Hill. And it takes place in a land like called Morden, okay? And you start out waking up from a nightmare, which was the first module. You have bits of memory in your thing, and this is a progressively harder one. Well, this one was 4 through 7. This one's 8 through 10. So basically, what the premise is you complete this module. Your characters level up a few levels, and then later on you play House on Griffin Hill as a direct sequel to that. Strad is possessing somebody. You got to figure out who he's possessing. Everything seems like deja vu. It is a good module. It is not as good as the original. I get what they were trying to do. You know, with any sequel, you want to try to do some of the same but progress something forward. Well, this ended up being a lot more complex, a little bit harder, the DM, a lot more to keep track of, but it has a lot of good, interesting stuff. It's nice and big, but it was a good, and it fleshed out the story a lot more. Okay, it did, and it was a very good module. I bought it because I love the first one. Okay, so end of story with that. Okay, so I got it, played it a couple times, nowhere near as much as the first one, but don't ever underestimate the fun you can have with Ravenloft 2. Although it doesn't get the praise I think it should, it's overshadowed by its better prior first Ravenloft. It's still a good thing, and it has a lot of good stuff in it. It's just a little bit more complex to run as a DM, and it can be a little bit more confusing for players. But it does introduce a lot of stuff that would come over to the campaign setting. And let's get to that. Okay, so this comes out in '86. Okay, at that point in time, a little bit after that, I'm done with Dungeons and Dragons. I don't even think about it anymore. It just doesn't. I don't care. To be honest with you, I'm at that age. I don't give a crap about this stuff anymore. I like video games. I like girls. You know, stuff like that. But if anybody remembers the early '90s, several industries of the early '90s were fixing to go through a big financial boom. Video games went through a boom. Comic book industry, especially around time the death of Superman, was fixing to go through a big boom. TSR was also about to go through a big boom, and they were fixing to ratchet a whole bunch of stuff up. And so I remember one day I was at Panama City Beach, Florida. I was there for spring break. We just so happened to go to the mall in Panama City during the daytime because the music store they had was a lot better than the music stores we had where I was from. And you know, we had a hard time finding our death metal bands and stuff where we were from. And so we went to the music store, and just on a whim, I went into the, I don't want to say it was Books A Million or something, one of the bookstores in the mall. And I saw a box, and it was this. It was the Ravenloft box set campaign setting. And I saw it, and I was like, what in the hell is that? Are they remaking Ravenloft? What? Is this something new? What's going on? Back then, when a box set came out, like, say for this, it was shrink wrapped. Okay, you couldn't open it and dig through it and see what it was unless you wanted to get in trouble with people of the store. So all you had to go on, and it's not like you could pull up your phone, hey, let me look that up on the internet real quick, or pull it up on Amazon and see what it is. It's not like you could do that. I read the back, and I was left wondering, still not exactly sure what it was. Sitting right next to it was the first adventure module for it, Ravenloft. So I looked at the back of that and I said, well, that has absolutely nothing to do with my old Ravenloft module. What in the hell? I had no clue as to what was going on, honestly. But I had some extra money at the time. So I said, you know what? I'm going to take a risk and I'm going to buy both products. I'm going to buy this Ravenloft box set and I'm going to buy this adventure module, and let me cross my fingers and hope it's something great. And it was. It was fantastic. Around that time, basically, TSR was going to expand and put out campaign settings for just about everything. They put one out for the Forgotten Realms, Greyhawk, Spelljammer, a science fiction one, Ravenloft, which is a gothic horror based setting, Dark Sun. There are probably a couple more. The Middle Eastern one, hell, the Oriental one. I mean, they were just fixing to put out a whole bunch of products for each setting. I mean, every setting. It got to the point where the TSR would put a catalog in a product, and the damn catalog would be thick. I mean, just take this thing, and then it's got all these different settings, and they're telling you what the hell's coming out. That's how you knew. See, back in the day, that's how you knew what was coming out. Okay, you couldn't get on the internet, or they didn't have a website. You freaking got on there, and you just freaking, oh, look at this catalog. Ooh, let's see what all this is coming out. And there you went. And so, what Ravenloft was, the campaign setting was they took the first and second Ravenloft modules and they made an entire world based off of those. And so, for you to play around in. Now, it was originally a Weekend of Horrors type campaign setting. You take your characters, and they're based in the regular world, which is either Greyhawk or Forgotten Realms, whichever one. And a mist would come in, swift them all off to Ravenloft, which Ravenloft became this continent that had a domain that was made up of a continent made up of several domains, kind of like the United States is made up of several states. Okay, 50 states. Well, this continent that had all these domains, each domain was ruled by a Dark Lord. And the Heart domain in Ravenloft was Barovia, where Count Strad von Zarovich ruled as a Dark Lord. Sometimes people, the citizens of that domain, knew who the Dark Lord was. Sometimes they had no idea who the Dark Lord was. Sometimes the Lord of the domain was some other political figure, and the Dark Lord hid in the shadows. And basically what it was they took every type of gothic horror trope you could think of and made him a lord of a domain. So you have him, he's a vampire lord of the domain. You have your Frankenstein's monsters, a lord of a different domain. You have a ghost that's a lord of another domain. You have a werewolf that's a lord of another domain. So it became really, if you loved gothic horror and stuff like that, like I did, and the undead and monsters and stuff, it became that. And the object became to basically play the adventure and find a way to get out back to your own world, because you couldn't leave Ravenloft once you got there unless something extraordinary happens, like the mist take you away, or you beat the bad guy or whatever. So and this began in 1990. I didn't discover it till 91, early 91. So that's when I discovered it. And it would go on from there. Now, I divided the Ravenloft basically up into 4 eras. And the first era is basically the campaign settings beginning all the way to the first big story arc gets resolved, and maybe a little bit after that. And you got to remember now, at this time, Ravenloft is pushing this stuff out, so where you're getting about, TSR is pushing this stuff out to where you're getting about a product a month, and that includes novels. And they did not only just do this with Ravenloft, they did this with basically every freaking campaign setting they had, and they had plenty. So if you can think about one Ravenloft product coming about out of every month, think about all the other products coming out and how TSR is just pushing out all these products. Like I said, it was a boom time, and they were just pushing products out. And you know, the quality control on some of these things aren't the greatest. However, the first era is basically the Weekend of Horrors type era. Ravenloft is really just, hey, let's go in, let's have take our characters, let's go play an adventure in Ravenloft, and the DM is like, good, I'm gonna make this, because it's harder in Ravenloft than it is in other campaign settings. That was a point of it, to be a lot harder. You cut off from your regular world setting. Spells don't work the same way. Monsters aren't as easy to beat. And so it's supposed to, as a DM, you're supposed to scare your players and use all this stuff. And players are supposed to be like, Ravenloft's supposed to build up such a bad reputation. It's like, oh my god, man, I hope my dungeon master doesn't send us to Ravenloft. Oh my god. So, yeah, modules, box sets, supplements, adventures, and even novels. And that's basically the first era of Ravenloft. And it lasted for about 4 years, 90 to 94. Then in 94 came out a reboot box set, which added, which basically progressed the story, because there's a story and events that happen in these modules. And that was one of the other big things I really liked about it, was it progressed the story. So you could be a character and you play a module, and Ravenloft acknowledges that you basically played that module and the events in that module happened and have a profound effect on the setting. I thought it was really cool. I loved that. And this is when Ravenloft started to forgo the Weekend of Horrors type era and started to become more of, hey, why don't you base your characters here, okay, and stay in Ravenloft as your campaign setting. Let it be a permanent campaign setting. You know, type thing. That's when they started to really work on that. And by the end of that era, they had kind of perfected it for the most part. But they had kind of got it to where, okay, no longer Weekend of Horrors type stuff, and progress the setting. The third era of Ravenloft is they do a reboot again. Well, I'm not saying reboot. I'm just saying almost kind of like a reset, but they don't get rid of anything that happened in the past. So when I say a reboot, I don't really mean that in that sense. I meant that they acknowledge what happened here. This acknowledges what happens back then, but they want you to really focus more along the lines of, hey, let's have your campaign based in Ravenloft. You're going to become citizens of Ravenloft. You're born here. You're going to die here. so and so, and let's flesh it out more. And it's still second edition, which, on a side note, I don't play any other D&D other than second edition. I grew up playing second edition. It's what I played when I was first doing it. The second edition lasted a very long time. You're talking basically almost a few years after Gary Gygax really created Dungeons and Dragons, all the way to basically almost 2000. You know, I played the third edition. I thought the third edition was okay. It had some problems. I didn't even touch fourth or fifth. I won't even touch them. I'm just sorry, I won't. I don't care for them. I'm not even gonna give them a chance. I'm not saying it's bad, and there are sites that you can convert this stuff to the other editions. I grew up on second edition. I believe that is when Dungeons and Dragons was its golden age of TSR, and that's when I'm stuck on it. Okay, that's how I play. It's what I always play, and I only play second edition stuff. That's the way it is. But I'm not criticizing the other ones for being flawed, although I do think they have some problems. I'm just not going to play those. So, and this was kind of like the last big hurrah of Ravenloft. This would last basically to 1998. At that point in time, TSR, who had pushed so many products for so many campaign settings, was starting to feel the bubble burst from the economic boom. And kind of like the comics book industry went and had their little bubble burst too around that time, TSR had the bubble burst, and they ended up eventually going bankrupt because they were just putting out too much product, and honestly a lot of it was crap and nobody was buying it, so it was just sitting on the shelves. If you want excuse me, it's TSR is a very interesting case study, parallel to the comic books industry of the 90s, of what not to do with a business. Okay, well, they went bankrupt. I think Wizards of the Coast bought them out, and Wizards of the Coast said, hey, guess what, we're not producing any more Ravenloft stuff. They killed a bunch of campaign settings, which, you know, it would make sense. You're not going to be putting out that many products. You had certain campaign settings that just didn't do well, and so they canceled a bunch of campaign settings and said they're basically not making nowhere near as many products, and said Ravenloft is one of the campaign settings that they're canceling, and so it was effectively the end of Ravenloft. And at that point in time, it was really disappointing because Ravenloft was really getting good. They had gotten good writers at that time for these products, and Ravenloft was starting to really ramp up. There were a few misses, but Ravenloft was really starting to get really, really good, and it would be a shame to see what could have happened with Ravenloft. However, and I think Wizards of the Coast was stupid for getting rid of Ravenloft. I can see you getting rid of a lot of other campaign settings, but there was a market for Ravenloft. Okay? Gothic horror, there's always a market for. But what they did was they licensed out the rights for Ravenloft to a company called Sword and Sorcery, White Wolf, basically. And they had White Wolf had come out and did like Vampire the Masquerade and stuff like that. As far as I know, that was the only campaign setting that ever got licensed out. TSR either just canceled them and got rid of them and only focused on one or two campaign settings. But they did. Ravenloft was popular enough that they did sell the license to Sword and Sorcery. And so Sword and Sorcery, around this time, 3rd edition came out. said, you know what, we're going to make Ravenloft products since TSR sold us the rights. And so the last era of Ravenloft is 3rd edition 3.5. Now, to their credit, they gave you a conversions tables to change stuff to either 2nd or 3rd edition if you didn't want to play. And then 3rd edition underwent an overhaul in the middle of it, and it became 3.5. Okay, that was terrible. Well, anyways, my big one bugaboo with Sword and Sorcery's control or handling of Ravenloft was they were not going to do any more adventure modules. It was all supplemental books and stuff like that. And that really pissed me off, because adventure modules are the things I love the most. That's what progresses the story. All of the story arcs that progressed in this campaign setting were because of the adventure modules. I mean, what am I going to play? You know, so it got to the point where I wasn't playing Ravenloft anymore. Okay? But I still collected Ravenloft. As a matter of fact, I would say probably around this era right here is when I stopped playing Ravenloft. I went and bought every product Ravenloft had because I loved the setting. I mean, I would read these books like I would read a good novel, and sit there and just on a rainy day read it, and it would give me such pleasure, because these things were great. Like, for example, there's probably one of the best supplements to ever come out was Carnival. It's this one right here, Carnival, and it read so damn. It's not an adventure module; it's a supplement. It just tells you about the freak show Carnival that's in Ravenloft, but it reads so good, and it was just it was like reading a good novel. And so when the 3rd edition started, I read it, and I read it like it was a good novel, and I loved it. It was just, I didn't care much about the rules and stuff, but what progressed the setting, how the setting was, who was there, so and so, it was great. And so I didn't play for many years, but every time a new product came out, I got it and added it to my collection with the hope to one day maybe play, or something would change, and so on. And so eventually, Sword and Sorcery, around 4th edition coming out, said, you know what, our license, we're no longer going to have the license. It's going to go back to TS Wizards of the Coast. I don't even know if Wizards of the Coast had been bought out by Hasbro at that time. Anyways, they were doing 4th edition, and so Ravenloft was effectively dead. And thus ends the Ravenloft saga, except for a few little cliff notes. In 4th edition, later on, I think in 2000, and this started in 99, I believe, or 2000, and lasted to 94. I think in 2006 they brought Ravenloft back for 4th edition, I want to say, but they only brought, it was basically a remake of just this module right here with a little bit expanded to it. Ravenloft, the campaign setting, was no more. It was just basically this. I know they've tried to say that Ravenloft was part of this shadow realm or some garbage like that. I don't know. I think it's nonsense. And they made Strahd like a little bit of elf in him or something. I don't know. It was bunk. I don't know. It was just garbage. They came out with some more novels that are very hard to find because they have nothing really to do with the campaign setting. They're all new ideas, and I never was for that. And they really don't fit. And then finally, I think 1 or 2 years ago, for 5th edition, they came out with a new version of Ravenloft, Curse of Strahd or something like that. And it's better than that 4th edition one. And but it's still not the Ravenloft campaign setting. It's still just basically this with a bunch more extra adventures fleshed out with it, to where you could possibly might have a campaign setting in some Shadowfell world or something. But again, it fails. Yet Ravenloft has remained very popular. They still have a website dedicated to them, the Fraternity of Shadows, who still puts out netbooks and stuff like that. And if you are ever a fan of Ravenloft, I highly recommend going to that website, the Fraternity of Shadows. Everything you ever wanted to know about Ravenloft, even some of the newer stuff, is there, and it's still being updated on that website. So it's not a dead website. They added Ravenloft to Neverwinter Nights. It's that popular. I never really played that game, but they do that. Ravenloft has its own board game from, the good old people at Wizards of the Coast or TSR or whoever the hell owns them now. Castle Ravenloft. It's got its own board game, which I had at one point in time. I don't have it anymore. But in there, they have 5 or 6 board games. Wrath of Charlemagne, Legend of Dritz, Castle Ravenloft, the Temple of Elemental Evil, and I think maybe the Tomb of Horror, or something to do with the Tomb of Horror. And so, which is basically their version of Descent, is basically what it is. But they have, the first one they did was Ravenloft. And so, what I plan to do each Saturday, well, we're going to suspend Sci-Fi Saturdays for the month of October, and we're going to go over each era on a Saturday of Ravenloft and go over the products, what I thought of them, what they were, and how good they were. A really good retrospect review of each era of Ravenloft. Now, I know this has nothing to do with board games, but like I said, Ravenloft is Gothic horror. It's October, it's Halloween. It has history for board games because this, I think, is where it came from. I love this setting. I love Gothic horror. And if you like my channel and you are interested in a lot of games that I play, you can see where I got my influence from. And believe it or not, you can still get a lot of these products on eBay real cheap. And if you play Dungeons and Dragons, 2nd edition, 3rd edition, you can still play these. As a matter of fact, from time to time, my 2 eldest daughters and my, okay, I'll go ahead and just say it. Now my two eldest, all my daughters really, love when I say, hey, as parents, we try, I think sometimes too much to get our kids interested in what we were interested when we were young. And, like with movies, music, TV shows, pop culture type stuff. And sometimes it sticks and they like it. Sometimes it doesn't. Like John Carpenter's my favorite director. I let my kids, or try to get my kids to watch John Carpenter movies, to appreciate him as much as I do. They love his movies. Iron Maiden and Megadeth are some of my favorite bands. I try to get my kids to listen to that. They have appreciation for music, and they hate it. They don't like it. They hate my taste in music. Well, when I introduce them, because they do like horror type stuff, they're like me in that respect. And when I introduced them to Dungeons and Dragons, I introduced them to Ravenloft. And every now and then, we will play a game, a module in Ravenloft, because they enjoy it. They enjoy, even though it may seem outdated and outmoded, and I think I could go into a whole dissertation on why I think the problem is with Dungeons and Dragons these days, and how it could be better. And they have a lot of competition out there. It's not the same world when I was a kid. When Dungeons and Dragons was in its heyday, the Atari had just come out. You had 3 channels, not including PBS on TV. Okay, so there was, you know, nowhere near as much in the world as competition for it. I honestly think this can be taken to a different thing, but I won't get into that. But still, the basic. Here's a piece of paper. Here's a pencil. Here's some dice. I'm the DM. Let's roll your character, and let's use our imagination with a few visual aids and play a good role-playing game. I don't think that'll ever go out of style, because board games take from that, except they have a board that you move a figure on. Okay, Dungeons and Dragons is kind of like the board game, just without the board, and but more things to do. I would say that. And every now and then we'd play, and they would love it. My girls would love it. My son, he loved it. And so every now and then we play this, and I dearly miss this. Maybe it was because it was from a time in my life that I was, you know, had a heavy influence on me, but I miss this a lot. There are just some days I just really regret what happened to this campaign setting, what happened to TSR in those days, and, you know, and I think about it. But I think this will be a great Halloween surprise. If you don't want to, you know, if you don't like this stuff, then hey, you know, don't have to watch. If you come seeing this because you like RPGs, but you don't like board games, but you happen to see this, you know, give my video playthroughs a shot. See if you like. You may become a fan of board games. If you're just a fan of board games, but you see what this has to offer, you may become a fan of this. A lot of this stuff you can still buy on eBay for really cheap. This is not an expensive hobby to get into for these. I mean, honestly, they're not. There's still plenty of this out there. A few things are hard to get, but most of this is cheap and readily available. And it all started with this. Back in 1983. Okay? Think about that. Just think about that for a second. Okay? Because Ravenloft is still around in one form or another. Because I just put out a product for it. And it's 2018. So think about how long, you know, 83 to 93, 93, 2003, 2003 to 13. You're looking at 35 years. This intellectual property game has been around in one form or another. Ravenloft has had video games made on it. They've had choose your own adventure style books made on it. So it's very popular, and I love it. And you know, like I said, give it a chance. But it's something. It's spooky. It's a little spooky. Something I would love to do for the month of October because it fits perfectly. So I hope to see you on my Saturdays, where we do the retrospective review of Ravenloft. Until then, have fun.